Welcome back, my friend. Before we start the video, I really need your support. The channel is going through a tough time and your help means everything. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone watching leaves just one like and one comment, we can easily make it happen. Don't forget to subscribe as well. And now, let's get started. Being a park ranger means being prepared for literally anything. We often wear many hats and act as communication between various service providers and authorities. We can be search and rescue specialists, emergency medical technicians, police officers, teachers, and sometimes even surrogate parents to lost children. The job demands that we always have our wits about us, or at least try to, and you develop a tolerance for certain sights, sounds, and smells depending on which branch of ranger work you specialize in. The Search and Rescue Division obviously deals with more grisly situations than most. When I first started this career 15 years ago, roadkill would make me gag, especially the putrid smell that rises from decomposing flesh on a hot summer day, the sweet cloying odor that seems to coat the inside of your nostrils and linger for hours afterward. While I by no means enjoy these encounters, I have simply grown accustomed to them. They become part of the job's landscape, like filing reports or maintaining trail markers. I have seen hikers who took catastrophic falls, their shin bones protruding through torn flesh at impossible angles. I have witnessed arms and ankles bent in directions that the human body was never designed to accommodate. There was even a car crash near the park's eastern boundary that required our assistance since the highway patrol needed extra hands to collect the scattered remains across 200 yards of asphalt. That incident was particularly challenging, but at least there was a reasonable explanation when I handed a crime scene investigator a piece of human tissue that I could not immediately identify. What I discovered on what seemed like a routine patrol deep into the park's most remote section could not be so easily explained, and it continues to haunt my thoughts even now, months later. One aspect of this profession that I treasure most is the freedom it provides. While we all have designated responsibilities and territories, unless there is a specific emergency or scheduled event, we can travel to any section of our vast parkland and conduct our work there. The park encompasses over 40,000 acres of dense forest, winding rivers, and rocky outcroppings that have remained largely unchanged for centuries. On that particular spring morning, I had chosen an especially remote location, precisely because it seldom receives visitors. These isolated areas sometimes reward us with sightings of wildlife that we can document and study, particularly some of our less populated species that prefer to avoid human contact. The wolves had been making a comeback in recent years, and there had been unconfirmed reports of mountain lion tracks near the northern ridges. There is no proper trail system in this section of the park. We maintain a rudimentary pathway for emergency access, but for the most part, this territory is left to nature and allowed to grow wild and overgrown. It lies too far from civilization for adventurous school groups or scouting expeditions, and the majority of recreational hikers head in the opposite direction toward the more developed camping areas and scenic overlooks. The morning was still fairly cool despite the season, with that crisp quality that spring air possesses before the sun climbs high enough to generate real warmth. Dew clung to every surface, and my boots left clear impressions in the soft earth as I made my way deeper into the wilderness. The forest was alive with the sounds of awakening wildlife, birds calling to establish territory, small creatures rustling through the underbrush, and the distant sound of water moving over stones. I had been walking for approximately 2 hours, documenting various plant species and photographing potential wildlife habitats when the smell first reached me. It was not immediately overwhelming, but distinct enough that I recognized it instantly. The metallic, organic scent of blood. My training kicked in automatically and I became more alert, scanning the surrounding area for signs of what might have occurred. Of course, I was not immediately alarmed by this discovery. We occasionally encounter bears in this region, along with other predators who hunt and consume their prey as part of the natural cycle. After all, this is genuine wilderness where the laws of nature govern survival and death. I expected to find the remains of a deer, or perhaps evidence of a territorial dispute between competing predators. However, what I was completely unprepared to discover would challenge everything I thought I understood about this peaceful section of forest, and it would fundamentally alter my relationship with these woods that I had come to consider my second home. As I followed the increasingly strong scent of blood, pushing through a dense thicket of brambles that caught at my uniform and scratched at my exposed skin, I noticed that the normal forest sounds had grown eerily quiet. The birds had stopped their morning songs, and even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed muted. This unnatural silence should have served as a warning, but my curiosity and professional training compelled me to continue forward. The smell grew stronger with each step, that unmistakable copper tang that accompanies significant blood loss. I had encountered this odor before at accident scenes and during searches for injured hikers, but something about its intensity in this pristine wilderness setting felt wrong, almost unnatural. I pushed aside a final curtain of low-hanging branches and stepped into a small clearing that I had never seen before, despite years of exploring this section of the park. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, surrounded by towering oak and pine trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater effect, and there, nailed to the thick trunk of the largest oak tree, was a human hand. The sight hit me like a physical blow, and I involuntarily took 2 steps backward, my breath catching in my throat. The hand had been severed at the wrist, not with the clean precision that would suggest surgical amputation, but with the ragged, brutal efficiency of someone using an axe or hatchet. Pieces of torn tissue dangled from the severed edge like grotesque ribbons, and the bone was clearly visible through the mangled flesh. The hand was positioned approximately 8 feet above the ground, spread wide with the palm facing outward as if waving goodbye, or perhaps reaching for help that would never come. A single railroad spike had been driven through the center of the palm, securing it firmly to the tree's bark. The spike was old and rusted, the kind that might have been salvaged from abandoned railway lines that once crisscrossed this region decades ago. Dark blood had pooled at the base of the tree, soaking into the earth and creating a stain roughly 3 feet in diameter. The blood had coagulated and taken on that dark brown color that indicates it had been there for several days, possibly as long as a week. Flies swarmed around the appendage in a frenzied cloud, their buzzing now the only sound in the otherwise silent clearing. What struck me as particularly disturbing was the deliberate nature of the display. This was not the result of an animal attack or an accidental injury. Someone had intentionally severed this hand, carried it to this remote location, and mounted it on the tree like some macabre trophy or warning sign. The positioning suggested careful planning and a familiarity with the area that implied either extensive knowledge of the park or multiple reconnaissance visits. I forced myself to move closer, fighting against every instinct that screamed at me to flee. My professional training took over, and I began documenting the scene with my camera, taking photographs from multiple angles while being careful not to disturb any potential evidence. The hand appeared to belong to a middle-aged individual, with calloused fingers that suggested manual labor, and a plain gold wedding band that had become embedded in the swollen flesh. No other body parts were visible in the immediate area, which raised disturbing questions about the location of the remaining remains. Had the perpetrator disposed of the body elsewhere, or were other sections of the victim scattered throughout different parts of the forest? The thought of stumbling upon additional gruesome discoveries during future patrols sent a chill down my spine. Retreated to a safe distance and immediately contacted my supervisor using the satellite radio that all rangers carry during solo expeditions. The reception was poor due to the dense tree cover, but I managed to relay the essential details of my discovery. Within 30 minutes, I could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching, and I used my emergency flare to mark the location for the incoming investigators. The next several hours passed in a blur of activity as crime scene technicians, detectives, and medical examiners descended upon the previously peaceful clearing. They established a perimeter, photographed everything from every conceivable angle, and carefully removed the hand for analysis. Investigators combed through every inch of the surrounding area, searching for additional evidence or clues that might explain how this horror had found its way into our sanctuary. As the sun began to set and the investigative team prepared to leave, I realized that this discovery had fundamentally changed my relationship with these woods. The sense of peace and solitude that I had always found here had been replaced by an underlying current of dread and uncertainty. The days following my discovery blurred together in a seemingly endless series of interviews, reports, and increasingly frustrating dead ends. Detectives from the state police interviewed me repeatedly, going over every detail of that morning with exhausting thoroughness. They wanted to know about my exact route through the forest, the time of each observation I had made, and whether I had noticed anything unusual in the weeks preceding the discovery. I found myself returning to the crime scene multiple times with various investigators, retracing my steps and attempting to remember details that might have seemed insignificant at the time. Had I seen tire tracks on any of the service roads leading into the park? Were there any footprints or disturbed vegetation that might indicate someone had been in the area recently? The questions seemed endless, and my inability to provide useful answers left me feeling increasingly helpless. The forensic analysis of the hand revealed frustratingly little information. The victim was determined to be a Caucasian male, approximately 45 to 55 years old, who had likely performed manual labor based on the callus patterns and scarring on his fingers. The wedding ring provided no leads, as it was a common style available at countless jewelry stores nationwide. Most significantly, the fingerprints and DNA sample yielded no matches in any law enforcement database. Hospital records within a 500-mile radius were searched for anyone who had sought treatment for a severed hand or traumatic amputation during the estimated time frame. Emergency rooms, trauma centers, and even veterinary clinics were contacted, but no one had treated an injury matching this description. This absence of medical records suggested either that the victim had died from blood loss before seeking help, or that someone had prevented him from reaching medical assistance. The railroad spike that had been used to attach the hand to the tree was traced to a lot manufactured in the 1960s, but thousands of these spikes had been distributed to railway companies throughout the region over several decades. Many had been abandoned or sold as scrap metal when sections of track were decommissioned, making it impossible to determine where this particular spike had been acquired. Search teams conducted systematic sweeps of increasingly wider areas around the discovery site, using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar in an attempt to locate additional remains. They searched abandoned buildings, caves, and every accessible section of the park's backcountry. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, no other body parts were found, and no physical evidence suggested where the rest of the victim might be located. The lack of progress in the investigation began taking a psychological toll on everyone involved. Detectives who had worked hundreds of cases expressed frustration at the complete absence of leads or logical explanations. The deliberate placement of the hand suggested that this was not a random act of violence, but rather a carefully planned message or warning. However, without knowing the victim's identity or the perpetrator's motivation, the meaning behind this gruesome display remained incomprehensible. As weeks turned into months, media attention gradually shifted to other stories, and the investigative team was reduced to a single detective who continued following up on tips and leads that invariably led nowhere. The case file grew thicker with reports of sightings and theories from amateur investigators, but none provided actionable intelligence. Local residents began reporting strange sounds and unexplained phenomena in various parts of the park. Some claimed to have heard screaming in the distance during late-night hours, while others reported seeing unexplained lights moving through the forest. Park management received numerous complaints about the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to have settled over the entire area, and several longtime visitors stopped coming altogether. I found myself becoming increasingly obsessed with the case, spending off-duty hours researching similar crimes and reading everything I could find about ritual violence and symbolic displays of human remains. I contacted retired FBI profilers and attended seminars on criminal psychology, desperate to find some framework that might explain what had happened in our forest. The isolation of the crime scene continued to puzzle investigators. The location was so remote that reaching it required several hours of hiking through difficult terrain. Yet someone had managed to transport not only the severed hand, but also tools necessary to secure it to the tree. This suggested either exceptional physical fitness and wilderness skills, or multiple people working together to accomplish the task. Sleep became elusive as my mind replayed the details of that morning over and over. I found myself questioning whether I had missed something important, some crucial detail that might have provided the breakthrough investigators needed. The image of that pale hand against the dark bark haunted my dreams, and I often woke in the middle of the night with the phantom smell of blood in my nostrils. The psychological impact of the discovery began manifesting in ways I had not anticipated. My routine patrols, once a source of peace and professional satisfaction, became exercises in constant vigilance and barely controlled anxiety. Every unusual sound, every unfamiliar scent, every shadow that seemed out of place triggered an adrenaline response that left me exhausted by the end of each shift. My colleagues began expressing concern about my behavior and mental state. I had become withdrawn and hypervigilant, jumping at unexpected sounds and spending excessive amounts of time documenting even minor irregularities that I encountered during patrols. The freedom and independence that had once made this job so appealing now felt like a burden, as I found myself isolated in vast wilderness areas with nothing but my own increasingly dark thoughts for company. The clearing where I had made the discovery became a focal point of morbid fascination for me. Despite having no official reason to visit the location, I found myself returning there regularly, ostensibly to check for any new evidence or signs of additional disturbance. In reality, I was drawn by a compulsion I could not fully understand or control. Each visit revealed subtle changes that might have been natural environmental processes or could have indicated human interference. Fallen branches appeared in different configurations. Leaves seemed to have been disturbed in patterns that did not match typical wind dispersal, and I occasionally found footprints that could have belonged to investigators, curious hikers, or someone with more sinister intentions. The tree itself bore permanent scars from the railroad spike, and I often found myself staring at the hole in the bark while trying to comprehend the mindset of someone capable of such a calculated act of violence. The surrounding vegetation had begun to grow back around the disturbed earth where the blood had pooled, but the grass in that area remained noticeably different in color and texture. Park management implemented new safety protocols in response to the incident, including mandatory check-ins every 4 hours during solo patrols and restrictions on accessing the most remote areas without backup. These measures provided a certain degree of comfort, but they also served as constant reminders of the violent reality that had invaded our previously safe haven. I began experiencing physical symptoms that my doctor attributed to stress and anxiety. Chronic headaches, difficulty sleeping, and digestive issues became daily challenges that interfered with my ability to perform my duties effectively. Prescription medications provided temporary relief, but the underlying tension and hypervigilance persisted. My personal relationships suffered as I became increasingly preoccupied with the case and less able to engage in normal social interactions. Conversations with family and friends inevitably returned to speculation about the crime, and I found myself analyzing everyone I encountered as a potential suspect or source of information. Trust became a luxury I could no longer afford, and paranoia began coloring my interactions with even longtime colleagues and friends. The seasonal changes that had always provided a sense of natural rhythm and continuity now seemed ominous and threatening. Spring brought concerns about what might emerge from the winter snow. Summer intensified the smell of decomposition from any animal remains I encountered. Autumn's falling leaves could conceal evidence or fresh horrors, and winter's isolation made every sound seem amplified and potentially significant. I started carrying additional equipment during patrols, extra batteries for my radio, a backup GPS unit, more comprehensive first aid supplies, and even a small digital camera specifically for documenting anything that seemed unusual or out of place. My supervisor commented that I had become the most thoroughly prepared ranger in the department, but I knew that no amount of equipment could address the real source of my anxiety. The ongoing presence of law enforcement personnel in the park created an atmosphere of constant investigation that affected both staff and visitors. Everyone felt as though they were under scrutiny, and the natural behaviors of wildlife seemed to change in response to the increased human activity and tension. Even the forest itself felt different, as though the violence that had occurred there had somehow altered its fundamental character. 6 months have passed since that spring morning when I stumbled upon the severed hand, and the case remains as mysterious as ever. The investigative file has been transferred to the Cold Case Division, where it will likely remain until new evidence emerges or similar crimes provide additional leads to pursue. The detective assigned to the case still contacts me occasionally to discuss potential new angles or to clarify details from my original statement. But these conversations have become increasingly infrequent and perfunctory. We have established a routine of checking the original crime scene and surrounding areas on a regular basis, maintaining clearer pathways and documenting any changes or anomalies that might indicate renewed activity. This practice serves both an official investigative purpose and provides a sense of control over a situation that has defied all attempts at resolution or understanding. The forest has begun to reclaim the clearing where the hand was discovered, and casual visitors would now find little evidence of the investigation that consumed so many resources and generated so much fear. Nature has a remarkable ability to heal and regenerate, covering scars and absorbing trauma in ways that humans often cannot. The tree continues to grow around the wound left by the railroad spike, and new vegetation has completely obscured the stained earth where blood once pooled. However, those of us who were involved in the discovery and investigation carry permanent reminders of what occurred in that remote section of wilderness. The knowledge that someone was capable of such calculated violence, and that they chose our sanctuary as the location for their disturbing display, has fundamentally altered our relationship with these woods that we are charged with protecting. I have developed new habits and routines that reflect this changed reality. My patrol routes now include regular checks of areas where similar displays might be established, and I maintain detailed logs of any unusual findings or observations. Photography has become an obsession, as I document everything that seems even slightly out of place or different from previous visits. The hand itself has become a symbol of all the unknown dangers that might be lurking in our vast wilderness areas. Park rangers across the country have reached out to share their own experiences with unexplained discoveries and unsolved crimes, and I have learned that such incidents are more common than the general public realizes. Remote locations provide perfect opportunities for those who wish to dispose of evidence or create disturbing displays without risking immediate discovery. Sleep remains elusive, and my dreams are often populated by visions of that pale hand reaching out from the dark bark of the oak tree. Sometimes I dream that I hear the victim calling for help, his voice echoing through the forest but never clear enough for me to determine the direction or distance. These nightmares leave me exhausted and emotionally drained, but they also serve as motivation to continue searching for answers. The wedding ring that was embedded in the swollen flesh continues to haunt my thoughts. Somewhere a spouse may still be wondering what happened to their partner, checking their phone for messages that will never come, and holding on to hope that has no foundation in reality. The victim's identity remains unknown, but his humanity is undeniable, and the knowledge that his final moments likely involved unimaginable terror and pain creates a burden of responsibility that I cannot simply abandon. Local folklore has begun incorporating the discovery into stories and legends that are shared around campfires and in community gatherings. The hand in the woods has become a cautionary tale used to discourage solo hiking and to emphasize the importance of staying on marked trails. While I understand the practical value of such stories in promoting safety awareness, their embellishment and distortion of the facts frustrates my desire for accuracy and resolution. New rangers joining our department receive briefings about the case as part of their orientation and training. They learn about the importance of thorough documentation, proper evidence preservation, and the psychological challenges that can result from exposure to violent crime scenes. These educational efforts help ensure that future discoveries will be handled appropriately, but they also serve as constant reminders of the unresolved mystery that continues to define our professional environment. The investigation may be officially suspended, but my personal commitment to finding answers remains unwavering. I continue reading about similar cases, maintaining correspondence with law enforcement professionals, and exploring new technologies that might provide fresh approaches to analyzing the limited evidence we possess. Someone somewhere knows what happened to that man and why his hand ended up nailed to a tree in our forest. The park continues to attract visitors who come seeking peace, adventure, and connection with the natural world. Most remain unaware of the violence that occurred in our most remote section, and I take some comfort in knowing that their experience of this beautiful wilderness is not colored by the knowledge that haunts those of us who work here daily. But I know the truth, and I carry the responsibility of that knowledge with me on every patrol, during every quiet moment when the forest seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the next terrible secret to be revealed. The hand may be gone, but its presence lingers in the shadows between the trees, a reminder that evil can find its way into even the most pristine and protected places. We maintain our vigil. We document our observations, and we hope that someday the mystery will be solved and justice will be served. Until then, we continue our work, forever changed by the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness beyond our sight, there may be someone capable of unimaginable cruelty, and that our peaceful sanctuary once served as the stage for an act of violence that defies explanation or comprehension. The forest keeps its secrets well, But we will never stop listening for the answers that remain hidden in the wind through the trees. Thank God nothing else has happened since, though I fear it may only be a matter of time. This is my true account of the events that happened to me in 2015. I was 32 years old, working as a mechanic in the small town of Millfield, Oregon. What follows is exactly as I remember it, though sometimes I wish I could forget. My name is Horus Villa Lobos, and this happened to me in 2015. I was a pretty ordinary guy, working as a mechanic in a small town in Oregon. My life was mostly uneventful, which was how I liked it. I had my routine: work, a few beers with friends at the local bar, and then home to my dog, Chester. I wasn't looking for excitement, and I sure wasn't expecting what came my way. The story starts on a Wednesday. I remember because my boss, Leo, always joked about it being hump day, trying to get us to push through to the weekend. That day was hot, unusually so for early October, and the garage was sweltering. The ancient ceiling fan did nothing but push the thick air around in lazy circles. We had a steady stream of customers, mostly regulars who trusted us with their cars. I was under an old Chevy, hands greasy, cursing at a stubborn bolt that seemed welded in place by years of neglect and Oregon rain, when the bell over the door chimed. The sound cut through the radio's static-filled country music and Earl's muttered complaints about parts suppliers. I slid out from under the car on the creeper, wiping my hands on a rag that had seen better decades. There was a guy standing there in the doorway, and something about him made the hair on my neck stand up. He was tall and gaunt, maybe 40, with hollow cheeks that suggested he hadn't been eating regularly. His eyes darted around the garage like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. He had on a faded black hoodie despite the heat, which should have been my first warning. But you see all kinds in this job. People who dress for comfort over common sense, people with something to hide, people just passing through town with their own stories. So I didn't think much of it at first. "Help you?" I asked, standing and stretching the kinks from my back. He looked around nervously before speaking, his voice rough like he hadn't used it much lately. "Yeah, my car's acting up. Keeps stalling out on me." "All right, bring it in and we'll take a look," I said. Nodding toward the garage entrance, he went out, and a minute later drove in a beat-up old station wagon that looked like it had survived the apocalypse. The thing was more rust than metal, with duct tape holding the rear window together and a front bumper that hung at an odd angle. As he got out, I noticed a tattoo on his neck, a strange symbol I'd never seen before. It looked like a circle with twisted lines radiating outward, almost like a dark sun. Something about it made me uneasy, but tattoos are common enough, right? I got to work on his car, trying to diagnose the problem while he paced around the garage like a caged predator. He was jittery, constantly checking his phone and glancing toward the windows. My buddy Earl noticed too and shot me a questioning glance from across the shop. I just shrugged, but I kept one eye on the stranger while I worked. The guy's restlessness was contagious. Every few minutes he'd stop pacing and stare at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just curiosity, it was like he was studying me, memorizing my face for some purpose I couldn't fathom. After about an hour of detective work, I found the issue: a faulty fuel pump, probably original to the car and long overdue for replacement. I wiped my hands and approached him where he stood smoking by the open bay door. "Found your problem," I said. "It's the fuel pump. We can fix it, but it'll take a couple hours." He looked irritated, crushing his cigarette under a worn boot heel. "How much?" I quoted him the price, expecting him to haggle or complain. Instead, he just nodded. "I'll wait," he muttered, settling into the plastic chair in the corner we kept for customers. Earl and I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The stranger, he'd introduced himself as Blake when I asked for a name for the work order, kept fidgeting. At one point, I caught him staring at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. It was almost like he recognized me, but I knew we'd never met. His face wasn't one I'd forget. The afternoon dragged on with unusual slowness. Even the familiar sounds of the garage, the hiss of the pneumatic tools, the radio crackling between stations, Earl's occasional curse when something didn't cooperate, seemed muted and distant. Blake's presence cast a shadow over everything, though I couldn't explain why. By late afternoon, we had his car running again. The new fuel pump hummed quietly, and the engine had that smooth idle that comes with proper maintenance. I handed him the bill and he paid in cash without counting it. Mostly 20s and 10s. The kind of crumpled bills that suggested they'd been carried in pockets for too long. As he was leaving, tucking the receipt into his wallet, he stopped at the door and looked back at me. The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast his face in harsh shadows, making his hollow cheeks even more pronounced. "Thanks," he said, then paused. His next words hit me like a physical blow. "You're Villa Lobos, right? Horus Villa Lobos?" I felt a chill run down my spine despite the garage's stifling heat. "Yeah, that's me," I replied cautiously, straightening up. "Why?" He nodded slowly, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I knew your dad." That was a punch to the gut that left me breathless. My dad had disappeared when I was 12, leaving behind nothing but questions and a hole in our family that never healed. He'd just vanished one day, went to work at the lumber mill and never came home. The police investigation had gone nowhere. No body, no note, no explanation. Just gone like he'd stepped off the edge of the world. I stepped closer to Blake, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What do you know about my dad?" Blake's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Ask around," he said cryptically, then turned and walked out into the fading daylight. I watched him drive away, his station wagon's engine running smooth as silk now, but my hands were shaking. 20 years of wondering, of trying not to think about the man who taught me to throw a baseball and change a tire, and suddenly this stranger appears with knowledge I'd given up hope of ever finding. That night I couldn't sleep. Chester, my loyal German shepherd, lay at my feet sensing my unease. He kept lifting his head, ears pricked, as if he could hear the turmoil in my mind. I kept replaying the conversation with Blake, wondering what he knew and why he'd waited until he was walking out the door to drop that bombshell. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Every creak of the settling wood made me tense. Outside, the wind moved through the Douglas firs that surrounded my small property, creating sounds that seemed almost like whispers. I found myself thinking about my father, remembering the last morning I'd seen him, the way he'd ruffled my hair and promised to help me with my homework that evening. A promise he'd never get to keep. Blake's words echoed in my head. Ask around. But ask who? And about what? My father's disappearance had been the town's mystery for exactly 1 week 20 years ago. Then it had faded into the background noise of small-town life. People moved on. They had to. But now, lying in my childhood bedroom in the house my mother had left me when she passed 5 years ago, I realized I'd never really moved on. I'd just buried the questions so deep I'd forgotten they were there. As the hours crawled by and dawn approached, I made a decision. I was going to find out what Blake knew about my father no matter where it led me. I had no idea that decision would drag me into a nightmare that would make my father's disappearance seem like the least of my worries. The morning light filtering through my curtains couldn't chase away the shadows that Blake's words had awakened. Something dark was stirring in Millfield, and I was about to discover that some mysteries are better left buried. The next day at the garage, I was distracted. Every customer who walked through the door made me look up hopefully, thinking it might be Blake returning with more answers. But he didn't show. Earl noticed my restlessness and finally cornered me during our lunch break. "What's eating you, Horace? You've been jumpy as a cat all morning." I told him about Blake and what he'd said about my dad. Earl, being the conspiracy theorist he was, leaned forward with interest, his sandwich forgotten. "That's weird, man. Real weird. You think this Blake character knows something about what happened to your old man?" "I don't know what to think," I admitted. "But he seemed to know who I was. Called me by name." Earl rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "You know what we should do? We should go to the Rusty Nail tonight. Your dad used to hang out there, right? Maybe Rick remembers something." The Rusty Nail was a dive bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where the beer was cheap and the conversations were cheaper. My dad had spent more evenings there than my mother appreciated, nursing a beer and playing pool with whoever was around. It wasn't a lead exactly, but it was somewhere to start. That evening, Earl and I headed to the bar as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The Rusty Nail hadn't changed much since my dad's days. Same flickering neon sign, same wooden doors scarred by years of opening and closing, same smell of stale beer and cigarettes that hit you the moment you walked in. We sat at the bar and ordered beers from Rick, the bartender who'd been there since before I was born. Rick was a weathered man in his 60s with gray hair and arms covered in faded tattoos from his Navy days. He'd seen every kind of trouble the human condition could produce, and very little surprised him anymore. "Hey, Rick," I said after we'd settled in. "You remember my dad, Joe Villa Lobos?" Rick's face softened slightly. "Yeah, I remember Joe. Good man. Quiet mostly. What's this about, Horace?" I explained the encounter with Blake, watching Rick's expression carefully. When I mentioned Blake's name, something flickered across the bartender's face. Recognition, maybe, or concern. "Blake, huh?" Rick said, his voice dropping. "That guy's bad news, Horace. Seen him around town lately, but he's trouble. As for your dad, well..." He paused, wiping the bar with a rag in slow, deliberate circles. "There's some things folks around here don't like to talk about." Earl leaned forward. "Like what?" Rick sighed, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. The bar was nearly empty. Just us, an old-timer playing the lottery machine, and a couple in the corner booth who were too wrapped up in each other to pay attention to anyone else. "Joe got mixed up with some people before he disappeared," Rick said quietly. "Weird folks. Real secretive. They had meetings, called themselves some kind of religious group, but it didn't feel right, you know? Had this symbol they all wore." My blood went cold. "What kind of symbol?" Rick made a vague gesture with his hand. "Like a sun, but twisted, dark-looking. Made me uncomfortable just seeing it. The same symbol I'd seen tattooed on Blake's neck. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture I didn't like." "What happened to them?" I asked, my heart pounding. "They left town around the same time Joe vanished," Rick said. "Nobody's seen or heard from them since. Good riddance, if you ask me. But Horace..." He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this Blake character is connected to them, you need to be careful." "Real careful?" Earl and I exchanged glances. This was getting deeper than I'd expected and a lot more dangerous. "Do you remember anything else about this group?" I pressed. Rick thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "They called themselves something fancy. The Order of something Dawn. Scarlet Dawn, maybe? They rented that old Henderson farm outside town for a while. Place has been empty for years, but there were lights out there at night sometimes. Strange lights." We finished our beers in relative silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When we left the bar, the night air felt colder than it should have for October, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Over the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. I started digging into old records at the library, looking for any mention of the Order of the Scarlet. Dawn, it wasn't easy, small town. Newspapers don't keep the best archives, but I found bits and pieces. A brief mention in the police blotter about noise complaints at the Henderson farm. A letter to the editor from a concerned citizen about unusual activities on the outskirts of town. A classified ad seeking spiritual seekers ready for transformation. Nothing concrete, but enough to paint a picture of a group that had operated in the shadows. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, remembered them too. She was a thin woman in her 70s who'd worked at the library for 40 years and had a memory like a steel trap. "Oh yes, I remember that group," she said when I asked. "They came in sometimes looking for books on unusual subjects. Ancient religions, mysticism, things like that. Made me uncomfortable the way they looked at people. Like they were sizing you up for something." "Do you remember their leader?" "A man named Cyrus, tall, thin, with these intense eyes. Spoke very softly, but when he talked, people listened. Had a way about him like he could see right through you." She shuddered slightly. I was glad when they left town. That evening, I was at home researching what I could find online about cults and missing persons when Chester started barking furiously at the front door. His bark was different than usual, urgent, almost frantic. I grabbed the wrench I kept by the door and looked through the peephole. Blake stood on my porch looking even more haggard than before. His clothes were rumpled and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him out of the darkness. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the wrench ready. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you," Blake said, his voice tight with fear. "It's about your dad, about what really happened to him." Against my better judgment, I let him in. Chester continued to growl low in his throat, not taking his eyes off Blake as we sat at my kitchen table. The house felt smaller with Blake in it, as if his presence had somehow compressed the walls. "Your dad?" Blake began, his hands shaking slightly. "He was involved with the Order. They took him, used him for one of their rituals. I managed to get out, but they're still out there, still looking for more people. More sacrifices." My blood ran cold. "Sacrifices? What do you mean?" Blake's eyes darted to the windows as if expecting faces to appear in the glass. They believe in this ancient power, something dark. They think sacrificing people gives them control over it, makes them stronger. Your dad, he was one of their victims. They killed him, Horus. And now that you're asking questions, they'll come for you too. The words hit me like a physical blow. 20 years of wondering, and now I knew. My father hadn't left us. He'd been murdered by a cult of fanatics who thought his death would give them power. Why are you telling me this now? I managed to ask. Blake looked desperate, haunted. Because they're after me. I've been running for months, but they found me again. And now that you're digging into the past, they know you're a threat. We need to stop them, Horus. We need to finish what your father started. What do you mean, what my father started? He was trying to expose them, to stop them. That's why they killed him. But he hid something first. Evidence that could bring them down. I know where it is. I stared at Blake, trying to process what he was telling me. Everything I thought I knew about my father's disappearance was wrong. He hadn't abandoned us. He'd died trying to protect people from monsters. Where? I asked. The old Henderson farm. They're using it again, Horus. The Order of the Scarlet Dawn is back. As Blake's words sank in, I realized my quiet life in Millfield was over. My father's ghost had returned to claim me, and I was about to walk into the same darkness that had swallowed him 20 years ago. But I had to know the truth. I had to finish what he'd started, even if it killed me. The next few days passed in a haze of planning and dread. Blake and I met twice more, always in different locations, always watching for signs we were being followed. He told me more about the Order, how they recruited vulnerable people with promises of spiritual enlightenment, how they slowly isolated their members from the outside world, and how they used fear and manipulation to maintain control. They target people who are lost, Blake explained during one of our clandestine meetings at a diner 20 miles outside town. People who've lost someone they love. People who feel like failures, people who are looking for meaning. They offer hope, purpose, belonging. By the time you realize what they really are, it's too late. How did you get out? Blake's face darkened. I saw what they did to your father. I was supposed to help with the ritual, but when I saw... He shuddered. I couldn't do it. I ran that night and never looked back. Been running ever since. According to Blake, the Order had returned to the Henderson farm 6 months ago. They were smaller now, maybe a dozen core members, but they were planning something big. A final ritual that would supposedly give their leader, Cyrus, permanent control over the dark forces they worshipped. We have to stop them, Blake insisted. If they succeed, they'll have the power to do whatever they want. Your father's death will have been for nothing. I wanted to go to the police, but Blake shook his head. They won't believe us. No evidence, no bodies they can find. They'll think we're crazy. And besides, he lowered his voice, Cyrus has people everywhere. The Order has been recruiting for 20 years. Some of them might be cops. So we planned to go to the farm ourselves to find the evidence my father had supposedly hidden and stop whatever the Order was planning. It was insane, reckless, and probably suicidal. But I couldn't let my father's sacrifice be meaningless. We decided to approach the farm on Saturday night. Blake had been watching their patterns. They held their main gatherings on Saturday evenings, when most of the town was settling in for the night and fewer people would notice unusual activity. Saturday came too quickly. Earl offered to come with us, but I refused. This was about my father, my responsibility. I wouldn't drag my friend into danger. As darkness fell, Blake and I drove separately to a point about 2 miles from the Henderson farm. We parked our cars hidden in a grove of trees and continued on foot, armed with flashlights, my toolbox, and what little courage we could muster. The Henderson farm sat in a valley surrounded by dense woods. The main house was a 2-story colonial that had seen better decades, its white paint now gray with age and neglect. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, an equipment shed, and what looked like a newer structure that hadn't been there in my father's time. We approached carefully, staying in the tree line. Lights were on in the main house, and I could see figures moving around inside. Cars were parked in what used to be the front yard. Maybe 8 or 10 of them, all dark-colored and unremarkable. There, Blake whispered, pointing to the barn. That's where they keep the evidence. Your father hid something in there before they caught him. We crept closer, using the shadows cast by the moon to conceal our movement. The barn was dark and appeared to be empty. Blake produced a set of lockpicks from his pocket, A skill from his days with the Order, he explained, and within minutes we were inside. The barn smelled of age and decay. Hay bales were stacked along the walls and old farm equipment rusted in the corners. But there were newer additions too. Symbols painted on the walls in what looked like dried blood. Strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Over here, Blake whispered, leading me to a section of the wooden floor that looked different from the rest. Help me move these boards. We pried up several floorboards, revealing a small cavity underneath. Inside was a metal box about the size of a shoebox. Blake lifted it out carefully, his hands shaking. "This is it," he said. "This is what your father died protecting." Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them showing the Order's rituals in horrific detail. Pictures of altars stained with blood, of people bound and terrified, of Cyrus himself performing ceremonies that defied description. And there were documents too, lists of members, financial records, and a journal written in my father's handwriting. I opened the journal with trembling hands and read by flashlight. My father's words painted a picture of a good man who'd stumbled into something evil and tried to stop it. He'd infiltrated the Order, gathered evidence, and planned to take it to the FBI. But they'd discovered his true purpose before he could escape. "We have to get this to the authorities," I said, but Blake grabbed my arm. "Listen," he whispered. From outside came the sound of chanting, low voices rising and falling in unison. Through the barn's dirty windows, I could see lights moving across the farmyard, torches or candles carried by robed figures. "They're starting the ritual," Blake said, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "We need to go now." But as we moved toward the barn door, it swung open. 3 figures in dark robes stood silhouetted against the night sky, their faces hidden by hoods. I couldn't see their features, but I could feel their malevolent presence like a physical weight. "Blake," one of them said in a voice like grinding stone, "you shouldn't have come back." Blake stepped protectively in front of me. "Run, Horus. Take the box and run." But more robed figures appeared at the barn's other entrance. We were surrounded. "Horus Villa Lobos," the lead figure continued, pushing back his hood to reveal a gaunt face with burning eyes. This had to be Cyrus. He looked exactly as Mrs. Patterson had described him, but 20 years older and far more terrible. "The son of Joseph. How fitting that you should join us on this most sacred night. What do you want?" I managed to ask, clutching the metal box against my chest. Cyrus smiled, but it was the smile of a predator. "Why, to complete what we started 20 years ago, of course. Your father interfered with our work, but his sacrifice wasn't wasted. His death gave us power, and now yours will give us even more." The other cultists began to close in. Blake pulled a knife from his jacket. When had he armed himself? And held it ready. "I won't let you hurt him," Blake said. "You won't be able to stop us," Cyrus replied. "You're outnumbered, outmatched. Your little rebellion ends tonight. What happened next was chaos." Blake lunged at the nearest cultist, his knife flashing in the dim light. I ran for the side wall of the barn, hoping to break through the old wood, but more robed figures poured in from outside. A hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. I swung my flashlight like a club, connecting with someone's head. The impact sent vibrations up my arm and my attacker staggered backward. "The box!" Blake shouted. "Don't let them have the box." I held onto it desperately as hands reached for me from all directions. In the confusion, I saw Blake struggling with 2 cultists, his knife red with blood. Then something hard hit me in the back of the head, and the world exploded into stars. When the ringing in my ears cleared, I was on my knees in the farmyard, surrounded by the entire Order. They'd formed a circle around Blake and me, their torches casting dancing shadows on the ground. At the center of the circle stood Cyrus, now wearing elaborate robes covered in the same twisted sun symbol I'd seen on Blake's neck. 20 years, Cyrus said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. 20 years since Joseph Villa Lobos tried to stop us. 20 years since his death gave us the power to grow, to spread our influence, to prepare for this moment. The metal box lay at his feet, its contents scattered in the dirt. All of my father's work, all the evidence he'd died to preserve, was now in the hands of the very people he'd tried to stop. "But tonight," Cyrus continued, "we complete the cycle. Tonight we sacrifice the son as we sacrifice the father, and the power we gain will be enough to open the final door." I looked around desperately, searching for any means of escape. But the cultists stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces hidden by hoods, their attention focused entirely on Cyrus and his terrible promises. Blake caught my eye and mouthed a single word. "Run." Then he threw himself at Cyrus, tackling the cult leader to the ground. The circle broke as cultists rushed to help their leader, and in the confusion I saw my chance. I ran into the darkness, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the woods. Behind me I could hear shouting, the sound of pursuit, but I knew these woods better than they did. I'd hunted here as a boy with my father before everything went wrong. I made it to my car and drove away as fast as I dared, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. In my rearview mirror I could see the glow of the torches at the Henderson farm, like a wound in the night sky. Blake had saved my life, but I'd left him to die with those monsters. And somewhere in those dark woods, the Order of the Scarlet Dawn was still conducting their terrible rituals, still planning whatever apocalyptic finale Cyrus had in mind. My father's ghost wasn't finished with me yet. The nightmare was just beginning. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made me think I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to hide robed figures waiting to drag me back to that farmyard of horrors. Eventually, I found myself parked outside the police station in town. I sat there for nearly an hour, clutching the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do. Blake had been right. Who would believe this story? A cult ritual sacrifice ancient powers? I'd sound like a madman. But I had to try. Chief Morrison had been a friend of my father's, and he listened patiently as I told him everything. His expression grew more skeptical with each detail, but he took notes and asked questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with tired eyes. "Horus, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You're not the type to make up stories. But what you're telling me," he shook his head, "it sounds like something out of a horror movie." "I know how it sounds, Chief, but you can check the Henderson farm. There's evidence there, ritual sites, probably Blake's body by now." Morrison sighed. "All right. I'll send a couple of officers out there in the morning. But Horus, if this is some kind of prank or if you're having some kind of breakdown..." "It's not," I said firmly. "My father was murdered by these people and they tried to kill me tonight." The chief promised to investigate, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was losing my grip on reality. I left the station feeling more alone than ever. I spent what remained of the night at a motel on the other side of town, too paranoid to go home. Chester whined and paced in the small room, sensing my distress. Neither of us slept much. The next morning, Chief Morrison called with news that chilled me to the bone. "We checked the Henderson farm, Horus. It's empty. Has been for months by the look of it. No signs of recent activity, no evidence of any gathering last night, nothing." "That's impossible. I was there. I saw them." "I believe you think you saw them," Morrison said gently. "But son, there's nothing there. Maybe you should talk to someone. Get some help dealing with your father's disappearance. It's never too late to process grief." They thought I was crazy. The Order had cleaned up their traces, probably moved to another location, and now I looked like a man who'd invented an elaborate delusion to cope with childhood trauma. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left Blake alive. I found him that afternoon, beaten and bloody, hiding in an abandoned storage unit on the outskirts of town. He was barely conscious when I discovered him, and it took several minutes to convince him I wasn't another cultist coming to finish the job. "They're gone," he whispered through split lips, pulled up stakes and left before dawn. "But they'll be back, Horus. They're not finished with us." I helped him to my car and drove him to a clinic in the next town over, where a tired doctor stitched his wounds without asking too many questions. Blake had taken a severe beating, but he was alive. "Why didn't they kill you?" I asked as we sat in the clinic's parking lot afterward. "They tried, but something interrupted them. Car coming down the road maybe, or they heard sirens in the distance. Had to scatter fast, left me for dead." He touched his bandaged face gingerly. "Joke's on them. I'm harder to kill than I look." Over the next few days, Blake recovered enough to tell me what he'd learned during his captivity. The Order hadn't given up. They'd simply moved their operation to a backup location, and their final ritual was still planned for the coming weekend on the night of the new moon. "There's something else," Blake said, his voice heavy with dread. "Cyrus knows about your mother." My blood turned to ice. "What about my mother?" "She didn't die of cancer, Horus. They poisoned her. Slowly, over months, making it look like a natural illness. It was revenge for what your father did, and a way to isolate you, make you vulnerable. The world seemed to tilt sideways. My mother, who'd raised me alone after my father disappeared, who'd fought so bravely against what we thought was cancer, had actually been murdered by the same monsters who'd killed my father. Where are they now? I asked, my voice barely controlled. There's an old mine shaft about 30 miles north of here. Abandoned silver mine from the 1800s. They've been preparing the site for weeks, carving symbols into the rock, setting up their altar. Saturday night, they're going to try to open what they call the Scarlet Door. What's the Scarlet Door? Blake's face was pale. According to their beliefs, it's a passage to the realm of their dark god. If they succeed in opening it, they'll have power beyond imagination. And the first thing they'll do is come after everyone who opposed them. You, me, anyone who knows their secrets. I thought about Chief Morrison, who dismissed my story. About Earl, who'd wanted to help. About Mrs. Patterson at the library, who'd given me information about the order. They were all in danger because of me. We have to stop them, I said. There are only 2 of us, and at least a dozen of them, plus whatever Cyrus might summon if the ritual actually works. Then we make sure it doesn't work. Blake studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this smart. We don't try to be heroes. We sabotage their ritual and get out alive. Deal? Deal. We spent the rest of the week planning. Blake knew their routines, their security measures, their weaknesses. The mine was in a remote area with only one access road, which would make escape difficult, but also meant they wouldn't have lookouts posted far from the site. Saturday arrived gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that promised rain. As evening approached, Blake and I drove to within a mile of the mine, then hiked through the forest to reach the entrance. The old mine shaft had been transformed into something from a nightmare. Torches lined the entrance and carved symbols covered every available surface. The twisted sun symbol of the order was repeated hundreds of times, etched into the rock with obsessive precision. We could hear chanting echoing from deep within the mine, the same rhythmic voices I'd heard at the farm, but louder now, more urgent. The ritual had begun. The altar will be at the bottom of the main shaft, Blake whispered. That's where they'll try to open the door. If we can disrupt the ceremony, cause enough chaos, maybe we can stop them. We crept into the mine, following the sound of voices deeper into the earth. The air grew colder as we descended, and our flashlights revealed more symbols carved into the walls, some of them seeming to pulse with their own malevolent life. The main chamber opened before us like a vision of hell. The order had assembled around a stone altar that looked ancient beyond measure. Cyrus stood at its center, his arms raised toward a section of the cavern wall where the symbols were carved deepest. The wall itself seemed to be shifting as if reality was becoming fluid. But what froze my blood was the figure bound to the altar. It was Earl. My friend lay unconscious on the stone slab, his wrists and ankles secured with rope. He must have come looking for me when I didn't show up for work, and somehow the order had captured him. They need a sacrifice to complete the ritual, Blake breathed in my ear. Someone connected to you, to your father's bloodline. Cyrus raised a curved knife above Earl's chest, and I saw the Scarlet Door beginning to form in the wall, a crack in reality itself, through which something vast and terrible was trying to push through. I couldn't let Earl die. I couldn't let these monsters succeed. I grabbed a loose rock and hurled it at Cyrus, shouting at the top of my lungs. The stone struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the knife clattering across the cavern floor. Chaos erupted. The cultists turned toward us, their chanting broken, and the forming door in the wall began to waver and fade. Blake and I fought our way toward the altar, desperate to reach Earl before the order could regroup. But Cyrus was faster than I'd expected. Even wounded, he moved with inhuman speed, snatching up the fallen knife and turning back toward Earl. "You're too late," he screamed. "The door is already opening. Your friend's death will complete what your father tried to stop." The knife plunged downward toward Earl's chest, but I tackled Cyrus at the last second, sending us both crashing to the cavern floor. We wrestled for the weapon, rolling across the uneven stone as cultists tried to reach us. Blake was fighting desperately against 3 robed figures, his face streaming blood from a fresh wound. Earl was stirring on the altar, beginning to regain consciousness but still bound and helpless. I managed to get my hands on the knife, driving it upward into Cyrus's chest. His eyes went wide with shock and pain, but also with something like triumph. "It doesn't matter," he gasped. "The door is already open." He collapsed, but his words proved true. The crack in the cavern wall had stabilized, and through it I could see something that defied description. A realm of endless darkness where things that had never been human moved with malevolent intelligence. The surviving cultists fell to their knees, some weeping, others laughing with mad joy. Their leader was dead, but his final ritual had succeeded. Something began to push through the Scarlet door, a tendril of living shadow that reached into our world with hungry intent. Where it touched the cavern walls, the stone withered and cracked. "We have to get out of here," Blake shouted, cutting Earl's bonds with swift strokes of his knife. "The whole place is going to collapse." Earl was weak but mobile, and the three of us ran for the mine entrance as the cavern began to shake apart behind us. The thing from beyond the door was still emerging, its alien presence too much for our reality to contain. We burst out of the mine just as the entrance collapsed in a roar of falling stone. But I could still feel the presence of the thing we'd released, spreading outward like an infection, seeking new ways to enter our world. Blake looked at the sealed mine shaft, then at me. "It's not over, is it?" "No," I said, thinking of the shadow I'd seen reaching through the door and the way the cultists had smiled even as their leader died. "I don't think it ever will be." 6 months have passed since that night at the mine, and I wish I could say everything returned to normal. But nothing about my life has been normal since Blake first walked into the garage with his cryptic knowledge about my father. The official story was simple enough. An old mine shaft had collapsed due to structural instability, probably triggered by recent rains. Chief Morrison mentioned it briefly in the local paper, noting that the site had been marked as dangerous and would be permanently sealed. No mention of cults or rituals or things that shouldn't exist. Blake disappeared 3 days after our escape from the mine. I came home from work to find a note on my kitchen table. "They're still out there and they know we stopped the ritual. I'm going underground for a while. Watch yourself, Horus. This isn't finished." He was right, of course. The Order of the Scarlet Dawn might have lost their leader, but their surviving members had scattered rather than disbanded. And something had come through that door in the mine, something that hadn't died when the tunnel collapsed. I started seeing the signs almost immediately. Animals in the area began acting strangely, either becoming aggressive or simply disappearing. Plants near the sealed mine entrance withered and died despite the spring rains, and sometimes late at night I could feel something watching me from the darkness beyond my windows. Earl recovered from his ordeal physically, but the experience had marked him. He'd seen things in that cavern that he couldn't explain or forget. We didn't talk much about that night. What was there to say? We'd witnessed something beyond human understanding, and we were both struggling to live with that knowledge. "You ever think about leaving town?" Earl asked me one day while we were working on a transmission rebuild. "Every day," I admitted. "But where would I go?" "And what about Chester? This is his home too." Chester had become increasingly protective since the night at the mine. He slept across my bedroom doorway now, positioning himself between me and any potential threat. Dogs sense things humans miss, and Chester clearly sensed that our troubles weren't over. The first clear sign that Blake had been right came about a month after the mine collapse. I was closing up the garage late one evening when I noticed a man standing across the street, just outside the pool of light cast by the street lamp. He was wearing a dark coat and hat, and something about his posture seemed familiar. When I looked again, he was gone. It happened several more times over the following weeks. Glimpses of figures watching me from a distance, always disappearing when I tried to get a better look. Someone was keeping tabs on me, and I had a pretty good idea who. The remaining cultists hadn't forgotten that Earl and I had destroyed their leader and disrupted their ritual. We were unfinished business, loose ends that needed to be tied up. I bought a gun, a .38 revolver that I kept in the drawer of my bedside table. I'd never owned a firearm before, but the events at the mine had convinced me that there were worse things in the world than bullets could handle. But bullets were still better than nothing. The harassment escalated gradually. My mail was tampered with. My truck's tires were slashed twice. Someone broke into the garage one night but didn't steal anything. They just rearranged tools and left symbols carved into my workbench. The same twisted sun that had marked the order, but smaller now, more subtle. A reminder that they were still out there. Chief Morrison took my complaint seriously this time. The mine collapse had left him more open to the possibility that dangerous people were operating in the area. Even if he didn't accept my explanation of what we'd really faced that night. "I've got patrol cars driving by your place more often," he told me during one of our meetings, "and I've reached out to the FBI about possible cult activity in the region. Whatever's happening, Horus, we're not going to let them intimidate you." But the federal agents who came to interview me were skeptical of my story, especially the parts about ritual sacrifice and supernatural phenomena. They took notes, promised to investigate, and left town after 2 days with nothing to show for their efforts. The real turning point came on a rainy night in October, almost exactly a year after Blake had first appeared in my garage. I was home alone reading in my living room while Chester dozed at my feet when the lights went out. Power outages weren't uncommon during autumn storms, but this felt different. The darkness outside my windows was too complete, too absolute. Even the streetlights were dead, and I couldn't see any lights from neighboring houses. Chester lifted his head, growling low in his throat. His hackles were raised, and he was staring at the front door with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and the .38, moving carefully toward the window to look outside. What I saw made me understand that my reprieve was over. They were standing in my yard, 5 figures in dark clothing arranged in a rough circle around my house. I couldn't make out their faces, but I didn't need to. The way they stood, perfectly still and patient, told me everything I needed to know. The surviving members of the order had come to finish what Cyrus had started. My phone was dead. No dial tone, no cell service. They'd cut the lines and probably had some kind of signal jammer. I was on my own. I considered my options. The house had 2 exits, the front door and the back door leading to the kitchen. Both were probably being watched. The windows were possibilities, but they'd see me coming and be ready. Chester suddenly barked once sharply, then fell silent. He was looking toward the kitchen now, his body tense with alertness. Someone was trying to get in through the back door. I moved through the house as quietly as possible, the .38 ready in my hand. Through the kitchen window, I could see a dark figure working at the door lock with practiced efficiency. They'd be inside within minutes. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of waiting for them to come to me, I went to them. I threw open the front door and charged outside, shouting at the top of my lungs. The sudden noise and movement caught them off guard. They'd expected me to cower inside, waiting to be taken. The figure at the back door spun around, startled by my appearance. I put 2 bullets in his chest before he could react, and he dropped without a sound. The others were closing in now, moving with deadly purpose. I ran for my truck, parked in the driveway, but another cultist stepped into my path. This one was a woman, middle-aged, with the same fanatic intensity I remembered from the mine. "You can't run forever, Villa Lobos," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We'll find you wherever you go." "Maybe," I replied, raising the gun. "But you won't." She lunged at me with a knife, but I was ready. The .38 spoke again, and she went down hard. 3 more cultists were converging on my position. I made it to the truck and got the engine started, but they reached me before I could pull away. Hands grabbed at the door handle, trying to drag me out of the cab. I floored the accelerator, and the truck lurched forward. One of the cultists was caught by the rear bumper and went down screaming. The other 2 were thrown clear as I spun the wheel hard to the right. In my rearview mirror, I could see them picking themselves up, their dark forms illuminated by my taillights. But I was moving now, putting distance between myself and the house where I'd lived my entire adult life. I drove through the night, stopping only for gas and to check that I wasn't being followed. By dawn, I was 3 states away, trying to figure out what to do next. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've been living like Blake, staying mobile, never remaining in one place long enough for them to track me down. Chester adapted to life on the road better than I expected, though I can see the stress wearing on him. He's getting older, and this constant vigilance is taking its toll. I've had contact with other survivors, people who've encountered cults like the Order or who've witnessed things that shouldn't exist. There's an informal network of us now, sharing information and warnings through encrypted channels and coded messages. The thing that came through the Scarlet door is still out there. I've seen reports from across the country, areas where reality seems unstable, where people disappear or change in inexplicable ways. The influence is spreading, slowly but steadily. and I don't think conventional authorities are equipped to deal with it. Blake surfaces occasionally, always in different places, always with new information about the Order's activities. They're rebuilding, recruiting new members, planning something bigger than what we stopped at the mine. And they haven't forgotten about us. The door we closed was just the beginning, Blake told me during our last meeting in a diner outside Denver. There are others, dozens of them, maybe more. And every time they succeed in opening one, it gets easier to open the next. So I keep moving, keep watching, keep fighting when I have to. My father died trying to stop these monsters, and my mother was murdered for his interference. I won't let their deaths be meaningless. Sometimes late at night in whatever motel room or safe house I'm occupying, I think about my old life in Millfield. The garage, the routine, the simple pleasure of fixing things that were broken. It seems like something from another person's life now, a dream of normalcy that was never really mine to keep. But then I remember Earl, tied to that stone altar, moments away from death. I remember the thing pushing through the Scarlet door, bringing its alien hunger into our world. I remember my father's journal, his desperate attempt to preserve evidence of the Order's crimes. Some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. This one chose my family 20 years ago, and it's not finished with us yet. I'm writing this account in a truck stop in Nebraska, with Chester sleeping in the passenger seat and one eye on the door. Tomorrow we'll move on to the next town, the next lead, the next battle in a war that most people don't even know is being fought. The Order of the Scarlet Dawn thinks they can outlast me, that eventually I'll make a mistake or grow tired of running. They might be right. But until that day comes, I'll keep fighting, keep exposing their activities, keep preventing them from opening their doors to whatever hell they worship. It's what my father would have wanted. It's what my mother would have expected. And it's the only way I know to honor their memory while protecting the innocent people who have no idea what's lurking in the shadows of their quiet lives. The road stretches ahead, empty and dark, but I'm not afraid of the darkness anymore. I've seen what lies in it, and I know how to fight back. Chester stirs in his sleep, probably dreaming of the home we can never return to. I start the engine and pull back onto the highway, heading toward whatever comes next. The nightmare isn't over, but neither am I. My name is Ezra Finch, and this happened to me back in 2014. I was living in a small town in Montana, a place called Three Forks, population 1,869 on a good day, the kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. And the biggest excitement usually comes from the high school football games on Friday nights. I worked as a handyman, fixing things around town, and I like to think I was pretty good at it. 23 years I'd been at it, ever since I graduated high school and decided college wasn't for me. Life was simple and I enjoyed it that way. I had a routine that suited me fine. Up at 6, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, then whatever jobs Mayor Hopkins or the townsfolk had lined up for me. Leaky faucets and squeaky doors, broken steps, nothing I couldn't handle with the right tools and a little patience. Most evenings, you'd find me at the local bar, the Rusty Nail, sharing a drink and a laugh with whoever walked in. The Nail wasn't much to look at, dim lighting, scratched wooden tables, and a jukebox that had seen better decades, but it was ours. It was where the town came together, where news traveled faster than wildfire, and where you could count on finding a familiar face no matter how rough your day had been. That particular Friday night in October, I found myself at my usual spot at the bar, nursing a Coors and chatting with my friend Jack Milner. Jack was the town's only mechanic, a big burly guy with hands like ham hocks and a booming laugh that could shake the windows. We'd known each other since high school, played on the same football team, and he was the closest thing I had to family after my parents passed a few years back. The bar was quieter than usual that night. Old Pete was in his corner booth, methodically working through his third whiskey. Sarah, the waitress, was wiping down tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for decades. The usual Friday night crowd seemed smaller, subdued somehow. "You hear about the new folks moving into the old Henderson place?" Jack asked, taking a long swig of his beer. His voice carried that tone he got when he had gossip worth sharing. The Henderson place. Just hearing the name made me shift uncomfortably on my bar stool. That Victorian house had been empty for going on 8 years, ever since old Mrs. Henderson died and left it to some distant relatives who never bothered claiming it. The place had a reputation even before it sat empty. Kids said it was haunted. Adults said it was cursed, and everyone agreed it gave them the creeps. Yeah, heard they bought it cheap, I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. Place has been empty for years. Kinda surprised anyone would want it. Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a whisper but still carried halfway across the bar. Apparently there's some kind of religious group. You know, one of those communal living things. Bought it sight unseen cash deal. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Religious group? That's what I heard from Maggie at the real estate office, Jack said, shaking his head. Strange folks, if you ask me. Showed up in 3 black vans all dressed the same. Didn't say much, just handed over the money and took the keys. I shrugged, trying to dismiss the unease that was creeping up my spine. As long as they don't cause trouble, I don't see why it matters. Everyone's got a right to live where they want. Jack grunted in agreement, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Maybe so. But there's something about that place, Ezra. Always has been. My grandmother used to say the land was sour, that nothing good would ever come of it. Your grandmother also thought the moon landing was fake and that Elvis was hiding in Billings, I pointed out, forcing a laugh. Yeah, well, she was right about the Petersons' marriage falling apart. And she called the bank closure 6 months before it happened, Jack countered. Woman had instincts. We moved on to other topics after that. The upcoming deer season, whether the Broncos had any chance this year. Jack's ongoing battle with his ex-wife over alimony payments. Normal stuff. Safe stuff. But I couldn't shake the image of 3 black vans rolling through town. Or the feeling that something had shifted in Three Forks. Like a stone thrown into still water. I should have paid more attention to that feeling. Later that night, walking home from the nail under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch, I found myself taking the long way around town, not consciously avoiding anything, just enjoying the crisp October air and the familiar sights of my neighborhood. But when I reached the corner where Elm Street branched off toward the Henderson place, I stopped. The house was maybe 2 miles down that road, hidden behind a screen of pines and birch trees. From where I stood, I couldn't see even a hint of it, but I could feel it somehow. Like a weight pressing against the back of my skull. The trees seemed darker down that way, the shadows deeper. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, then another, then several more, their voices joining in a chorus that raised the hair on my arms. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the barking stopped. The silence that followed was complete, absolute. I turned and walked home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me go. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after my conversation with Jack at the Rusty Nail. I was in my workshop behind the house, trying to resurrect an ancient lawnmower that Mrs. Peterson insisted was worth saving, when the phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet. Ezra? Mayor Hopkins' voice crackled through the receiver, sounding more strained than usual. I need you to head out to the Henderson place. They've got some issues with the plumbing, and you're the best we've got. I felt that familiar cold settle in my gut. The new folks? That's right. Fellow named Samuel called this morning. Says they've got a backed-up drain system. Maybe worse. Could be a real mess if it's not handled soon. I found myself hesitating, which wasn't like me. Work was work, and the Henderson place was just another house when you got right down to it. Sure thing, Mayor. I'll head over there this afternoon. Appreciate it, Ezra, and, Hopkins paused, and I could hear him drumming his fingers on his desk the way he did when he was nervous. Be professional, you know? These folks are new to town and we want to make a good impression. When am I not professional? I asked, but Hopkins had already hung up. The drive to the Henderson place took me about half an hour, winding through farmland and forest on roads that got progressively narrower and more isolated. I'd driven out this way a few times over the years, once to fix a generator for old Henderson himself, another time to help with some tree damage after a bad storm. But it had been at least 5 years since I'd made this trip. The house sat in a natural clearing surrounded by woods that seemed to press in from all sides. It was a Victorian, built sometime in the 1890s when the railroad money was flowing and people had grand ideas about taming the wilderness. 3 stories of dark wood and gingerbread trim, with a wraparound porch and windows that looked like watching eyes. Even in its heyday, it had been an imposing place. Now, after years of neglect, it looked downright menacing. The paint was peeling in long strips, revealing gray wood underneath. Shingles were missing from the roof, and the porch sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The yard, once carefully maintained, had grown wild with weeds and volunteer trees. But as I pulled up the gravel driveway, I realized the new owners had been busy. The worst of the overgrowth had been cleared away, and scaffolding lined one wall where someone had been working on the siding. 3 black vans were parked near the house. The same ones Jack had mentioned, I assumed. More unsettling were the people I could see moving around the property. There were maybe a dozen of them, all dressed in the same dark plain clothing. They moved with purpose but without speaking, like actors in a silent film. Even from a distance, there was something mechanical about their movements, something that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my toolbox from the truck bed and approached the front door. Before I could knock, it swung open to reveal a tall, thin man with gaunt features and the most piercing blue eyes I'd ever seen. He was maybe 50, with prematurely gray hair and skin that looked like it rarely saw sunlight. "Mr. Finch," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. It wasn't a question. "I am Samuel. Thank you for coming." "Just Ezra is fine," I said, offering what I hoped was a friendly smile. "Understand you've got some plumbing troubles." Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "Indeed. Please, follow me." He led me into the house, and I immediately understood why the Henderson place had such a dark reputation. The interior was dimly lit, with heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light. The air felt thick and oppressive, carrying the smell of old wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and unpleasant. The furniture was sparse and utilitarian, nothing like the ornate Victorian pieces you'd expect in a house like this. Instead, there were simple wooden chairs and tables, all arranged with mathematical precision. The walls were bare except for a few religious symbols I didn't recognize, not crosses or stars of David, but geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "The problem is in the basement," Samuel said, leading me toward a door I hadn't noticed at first. It was painted the same dark color as the walls, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. We descended a narrow staircase into a basement that was larger than I'd expected, extending under what must have been the entire house. The ceiling was low, forcing me to duck in places, and the walls were rough stone that wept moisture. A single bare bulb provided the only light, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance with every small movement. The smell down here was worse. That same organic odor, but stronger, mixed with something metallic that made my mouth water in an unpleasant way. I tried to breathe through my mouth as Samuel led me to a utility room where the house's plumbing converged. "Here," he said, pointing to a floor drain that was indeed backed up. Dark water had pooled around it, and the smell was coming from whatever was causing the blockage. "Shouldn't take too long," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'll have this fixed in no time." Samuel nodded again. "I will leave you to your work." As soon as he was gone, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. There was something about the man that put me on edge. The way he stared without blinking, the careful precision of his words, the feeling that he was evaluating every move I made. I got to work with the drain snake, trying to clear whatever was causing the backup. The blockage was stubborn, and I had to put my full weight behind the tool to make any progress. When it finally gave way, a rush of dark water surged up from the drain, carrying with it chunks of organic matter that I tried not to examine too closely. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of draining water. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the basement, beyond the circle of light from the single bulb. I stopped working and listened, but the sound had stopped. Just the pipe settling, I told myself. But my voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the confined space. I finished the job as quickly as I could, testing the drain to make sure it was flowing properly. The water ran clear now, carrying away the last traces of whatever had been blocking it. But the smell lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I packed up my tools, I heard it again. That whisper, soft and sibilant, like wind through dry leaves. This time I was sure it wasn't the pipes. I turned toward the sound, peering into the darkness beyond the utility room. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did it. No response. Just that oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I climbed the stairs quickly, eager to get out of that basement and back into something resembling natural light. Samuel was waiting for me in the kitchen, standing so still he might have been carved from stone. "The problem is resolved," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Drain was backed up with debris, but it's flowing clear now. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." "Excellent," Samuel said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing an envelope. "Your payment." I took the envelope without opening it, tucking it into my shirt pocket. "If you have any other problems, don't hesitate to call." "We appreciate your discretion," Samuel said, and there was something in his tone that made it sound less like a comment and more like a warning. I made my way back to my truck as quickly as I could without running, all too aware of the eyes I could feel watching me from the house's dark windows. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, the Henderson place disappearing behind the trees, that I allowed myself to relax, but even then, I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper in the basement, or the feeling that I'd seen something in the shadows that my mind refused to process, something that explained the smell and the strange behavior of the people at the house, and the way my skin had crawled from the moment I'd set foot on the property. That night at the Rusty Nail, I told Jack about the job, but I found myself editing the story, leaving out the more unsettling details. "Just strange people being strange," I told him. Nothing more. But as I walked home that night, I found myself looking over my shoulder more than usual, and I made sure to lock my doors before going to bed. The first disappearance happened 3 days after my visit to the Henderson place. Lisa Thompson was the town librarian, a quiet woman in her mid-30s who lived alone in a small house near the elementary school. She was the kind of person who faded into the background, pleasant enough but unremarkable, the sort you might not notice unless you needed help finding a book or renewing a library card. When she didn't show up for work on Thursday morning, the assistant librarian, Carol Hendricks, assumed Lisa was sick and called her house no answer. By afternoon, Carol was worried enough to drive over and check on her. Lisa's car was in the driveway, her mail was overflowing from the box, and no one answered the door. Sheriff Nolan found the house unlocked, Lisa's purse on the kitchen counter, her keys on the table by the door. No signs of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Probably went to visit family, people said. Had some kind of emergency and forgot to tell anyone. But Lisa had no family to speak of, and even if she had, she wasn't the type to leave without making arrangements for the library. The town was unsettled but not yet panicked. People disappear sometimes, even in small towns. Maybe especially in small towns, where the isolation can drive folks to desperate measures. Then Bill Evans went missing. Bill was a retired farmer, 72 years old and stubborn as a mule. He lived by himself on 10 acres outside town, tending a small garden and complaining about the government to anyone who would listen. His nearest neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, noticed his mail piling up on Friday. By Saturday, she was concerned enough to call Sheriff Nolan. They found Bill's house the same way they'd found Lisa's, door unlocked, no signs of struggle, personal belongings undisturbed. His old pickup truck was in the driveway, keys in the ignition. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the kitchen table, the bread gone stale but not moldy. Now the town was scared. 2 disappearances in 4 days was more than coincidence, especially when both scenes showed the same impossible characteristics. People started looking over their shoulders, checking their locks twice, keeping their children close. The Rusty Nail, usually busy on weekend nights, was nearly empty. Even Jack seemed subdued when I met him there on Saturday evening. "What do you think happened to them?" he asked, nursing a beer that he'd barely touched. I shook my head. "No idea. Sheriff have any leads? If he does, he's not sharing them." Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice even though we were practically alone in the bar. "But I heard something interesting from my cousin Danny. He works for the power company, does meter readings." "Yeah?" "Says he was out by the Henderson place yesterday and he saw something strange. Smoke coming from behind the house like they were burning something big. But when he got closer to check the meter, the smoke stopped, and he couldn't see any fire." A chill ran down my spine. Could have been anything. Burning brush, trash, whatever. "Maybe," Jack said, but he didn't sound convinced. Danny said the smell was wrong, though. Not like burning wood or leaves. More like... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Like what?" "Like meat," Jack finished quietly. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us probably thinking the same thing but neither wanting to voice it. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. Probably nothing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Just folks being paranoid. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about smoke and strange smells and people who disappeared without a trace. Every small sound made me tense. The house settling, wind in the trees, a cat yowling somewhere in the distance. I found myself thinking about the basement at the Henderson place, about the whisper I'd heard and the feeling of being watched. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As I waited for it to brew, I pulled out the envelope Samuel had given me and counted the bills inside. $200 for a job that shouldn't have paid more than $50. Why had they overpaid so much? And what had Samuel meant about appreciating my discretion? I was still puzzling over these questions when someone knocked on my door. The sound was so unexpected at that hour that I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to my heart pound as the knocking came again, soft but insistent. Ezra Finch. The voice was female, young and terrified. "Please, I need your help." I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A young woman stood on my porch, pale and shaking in the porch light. She looked to be in her early 20s with long dark hair and wide, frightened eyes. I didn't recognize her. "Who are you?" I called through the door. "My name is Emily," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I need to talk to you about the Henderson place." My blood went cold. I unlocked the door and opened it, keeping the chain engaged. "What about it?" "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "They're looking for me. I don't have much time." Against every instinct screaming at me to keep the door locked, I let her in. She was wearing dark clothing similar to what I'd seen at the Henderson place, but it was torn and dirty, as if she'd been running through the woods. Her hands were scratched and bleeding, and there were leaves in her hair. "Thank you," she said, collapsing into one of my kitchen chairs. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me." "Believe what?" I asked, pouring her a cup of coffee. Her hands shook as she wrapped them around the mug. "That they're dangerous," she whispered. "The people at the Henderson place, they're not what they seem." I sat down across from her, trying to keep my voice calm. "What do you mean?" Emily took a shaky sip of coffee, then looked directly at me with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "I was part of their group. Samuel found me in Billings 6 months ago when I was living on the streets. He promised community, purpose, a family. I was so desperate," and she trailed off, staring into her coffee cup. "Go on," I said gently. "At first it seemed wonderful. Everyone was so kind, so welcoming. They took care of me, gave me clean clothes, decent food, a place to belong. But gradually things changed. The rules became stricter, the punishments harsher, and the teachings." Emily shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Samuel preaches about transcendence, about shedding the corrupt flesh to achieve spiritual purity. He says the outside world is poison, that only through sacrifice can we cleanse ourselves and reach enlightenment." "What kind of sacrifice?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Human sacrifice," she whispered. "He believes that by taking the life of the impure, the corrupt, we can absorb their essence and purify it. The missing people, Lisa Thompson, Bill Evans, they're not missing. They're dead." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected something was wrong at the Henderson place, but this was beyond my worst fears. "I tried to leave before," Emily continued, "but they caught me. Samuel said I was too valuable to lose, that I had a special role to play in the final ritual. He kept me locked in the basement for 3 days, telling me about his vision of purification, of the great cleansing that was coming." "How did you escape?" "Tonight was supposed to be another ceremony. They drugged my food to make me compliant, but I managed to hide most of it under my tongue and spit it out later. When they took me to the basement, I was awake enough to fight. I managed to get away, but they're looking for me. They'll never stop looking." I stared at her, part of me wanting to dismiss her story as the ravings of a traumatized young woman, but I remembered the whisper in the basement, the overpayment, Samuel's warning about discretion. Too many pieces fit together. "We need to call the police," I said. Emily shook her head frantically. "They won't believe me. Samuel is careful. He's convinced everyone in town that we're just a harmless religious group. And besides, by the time the police investigate, they'll have moved the evidence. They're very good at cleaning up." "Then what do you want me to do?" She leaned forward, grabbing my hand with fingers that were ice cold. "Help me gather proof. You've been inside the house, you know the layout. We can get evidence that even the police can't ignore." Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was insane, that I should call Sheriff Nolan immediately and let him handle it. But I kept thinking about Lisa Thompson and Bill Evans, about the whisper in the basement and the smell of something burning behind the Henderson place. If they really are killing people, I said slowly, why haven't they killed you? Emily's face went pale. Because I'm not meant to be killed, she whispered. I'm meant to be the killer. Samuel has been training me, preparing me for the final ritual. He says I have the purity of spirit needed to complete the cleansing. The next sacrifice is supposed to be made by me to prove my worthiness. When? Tomorrow night, Halloween. I felt the blood drain from my face. Halloween was still considered a pagan holiday by many religious groups, a time when the barrier between the living and dead was thinnest. If Samuel truly believed in his twisted doctrine, it would be the perfect night for his final ritual. All right, I heard myself saying. We'll get your proof. We waited until after midnight before making our move toward the Henderson place. Emily had spent the day hidden in my workshop while I went through the motions of normalcy, fixing Mrs. Patterson's leaky faucet, replacing a broken window for the Methodist church, nodding politely when people asked if I'd heard anything new about the missing people. Every interaction felt surreal, like I was playing a role in a play I didn't understand. How could people go about their daily routines when a cult of killers was operating just miles away? But then again, they didn't know what Emily and I knew. They hadn't heard her story or seen the terror in her eyes. As the sun set on Halloween night, Three Forks looked like any other small town preparing for trick-or-treaters. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed on porches, fake cobwebs draped from trees, and children in costumes ran from house to house with bags of candy. The normalcy felt obscene. Emily had barely eaten all day, spending most of her time staring out the workshop window at the tree line, as if expecting Samuel and his followers to emerge from the forest at any moment. When I asked if she wanted to back out, she shook her head firmly. They have to be stopped, she said. I won't let anyone else die because of my cowardice. We drove to within a mile of the Henderson place, then abandoned my truck on a logging road and continued on foot. Emily knew the property well, guiding us through the woods along deer paths that kept us hidden from the main driveway. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate but also making us feel exposed whenever we had to cross open ground. As we got closer to the house, we could see lights in the windows, more lights than I'd seen during my plumbing visit. The black vans were still parked near the front entrance, but now they were joined by several other vehicles I didn't recognize. More people have arrived, Emily whispered. For the ceremony, we crept closer using the overgrown landscaping as cover. Through the windows, I could see figures moving around inside the house, all dressed in the same dark clothing I'd seen before. But tonight, their movements seemed different, more purposeful, more ritualistic. The basement entrance is around back, Emily said, pointing toward the rear of the house. There's an exterior door that leads directly down. That's how they bring in the... She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. That's how they brought in their victims. We circled around to the back of the property, staying well within the tree line. The rear of the house was darker, with only a few windows showing light. But what caught my attention was the smell. That same organic odor I'd noticed during my plumbing job, but stronger now, mixed with something that made my stomach turn. There. Emily pointed to a set of concrete steps leading down to a heavy wooden door. That's the entrance to the ritual chamber. The ritual chamber. Not just a basement, but a place specifically designed for Samuel's twisted ceremonies. I felt sick thinking about what had happened down there, about Lisa and Bill and whoever else had disappeared over the months. We approached the exterior door carefully. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. But then again, who would be stupid enough to break into a cult stronghold? Besides us, apparently. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. I had brought a small flashlight, but I was reluctant to use it in case the light was visible from inside the house. We descended slowly, feeling our way along the rough stone walls. The smell grew stronger as we went deeper, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a corridor I hadn't seen during my previous visit. This part of the basement was separate from the utility room where I'd worked on the drain. Emily grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to bruise. "This way," she whispered, leading me toward a faint light visible around a corner. What we found defied my worst fears. The ritual chamber was a large room carved from the living rock beneath the house. The walls were covered with symbols painted in what looked like dried blood. Not the geometric patterns I'd seen upstairs, but something older, more primitive. Candles provided the only light, casting dancing shadows that made the symbols seem to writhe and move. In the center of the room stood an altar made from rough-hewn stone, its surface stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. Around the altar, the floor was marked with a complex pattern of circles and lines, also painted in what appeared to be blood, but it was the objects arranged around the room that made my breath catch in my throat. Personal belongings, a purse I recognized as Lisa Thompson's, Bill Evans's worn baseball cap, other items that must have belonged to victims I didn't even know about yet, trophies, proof of Samuel's crimes. "My God," I whispered, pulling out my phone to take pictures. The camera flash seemed blindingly bright in the dark chamber, and I winced, expecting alarms to sound or footsteps to come running. Instead, we heard voices from somewhere above us, chanting in a language I didn't recognize, the words rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. "They've started," Emily said, her face pale in the candlelight. "The ceremony has begun." I took as many photos as I could, documenting every angle of the chamber, every piece of evidence. The chanting grew louder, and now I could hear footsteps on the floor above us, moving in a pattern that suggested some kind of procession or dance. "We need to get out of here," I said, but Emily was staring at something in the far corner of the chamber that I hadn't noticed before. It was a cage, roughly welded from steel bars just large enough to hold a person. And inside, "Jesus," I breathed. The figure huddled in the cage was barely recognizable as human, emaciated, filthy, wearing rags that might once have been clothing. At first I thought it was a corpse, but then I saw the slight rise and fall of its chest. "Tom Hendricks," Emily whispered. "He was a drifter who came through town about 2 weeks ago. Samuel said he was perfect for the final ritual because no one would miss him. Tom Hendricks." I remembered him now. A vagrant who'd been sleeping in the park until Sheriff Nolan moved him along. I'd seen him panhandling outside the grocery store, and like most people, I'd looked the other way. Now he was going to die because of our collective indifference. "We have to get him out," I said, moving toward the cage. "Ezra, no." Emily grabbed my arm. "If we try to free him now, they'll know we were here. They'll disappear, destroy the evidence, and we'll never be able to prove what they've done." She was right, but that didn't make it any easier to look at the broken man in the cage and walk away. I took more photos, including several of Tom Hendricks, then forced myself to turn toward the exit. That's when we heard the footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming down to the ritual chamber, and we were trapped. The only exit was the way we'd come in, and whoever was descending would see us the moment we tried to leave. Emily pointed frantically toward a shadowed recess behind the altar. We dove for cover just as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, pressing ourselves against the cold stone wall and trying to control our breathing. 3 figures entered the chamber, all wearing dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces, but I recognized Samuel's voice when he spoke. "Everything is prepared," he said to his companions. "The vessel awaits and the instrument of cleansing is ready. Tonight we complete the great work." One of the other figures moved to the cage and unlocked it, dragging Tom Hendricks out with surprising gentleness. The poor man was so weak he could barely stand, swaying like a reed in the wind as they positioned him near the altar. "Where is the girl?" Samuel asked. "Still missing," one of his followers replied. "But we have searched everywhere. She cannot have gone far. She must be found," Samuel said, his voice carrying a cold fury that made my blood freeze. "Without her, the ritual is incomplete. She is the chosen one, the pure vessel through which the cleansing must flow. Perhaps we should postpone—" "No!" The word cracked like a whip. "Too much has been sacrificed to reach this moment. We will proceed as planned. If the girl cannot be found, then we will improvise the bow." Followers began arranging candles around the altar in a specific pattern, while Samuel opened what looked like an ancient book and began reading from it in that same unknown language we'd heard upstairs. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Tom Hendricks began to whimper. I looked at Emily, whose face was white with terror. We both knew we were witnessing the preparation for a murder, and there was nothing we could do to stop it without revealing ourselves. Even if we tried to intervene, we were outnumbered and trapped in a room with only one exit. But I couldn't just watch a man die. I was about to spring from our hiding place when Emily grabbed my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. She shook her head frantically, pointing upward. I could hear what she'd noticed, more footsteps above us moving toward the basement stairs. How many people were in this house? How large was Samuel's cult? The ritual continued, building toward some terrible climax when suddenly the sound of sirens shattered the night air. Police sirens getting closer fast. Samuel's chanting stopped abruptly. What is that? The sirens were close now, right outside the house. Car doors slammed and I could hear shouting voices. Sheriff Nolan's among them. We have been betrayed, Samuel said, his voice deadly calm. Gather the sacred items. We must leave immediately. His followers moved with practiced efficiency, collecting candles, ritual implements, and the mysterious book. Within minutes, they had cleared most of the evidence from the chamber. What about him? One of them asked, pointing to Tom Hendricks. Samuel looked at the broken man with cold calculation. Leave him. He is too weak to speak coherently, and without the other evidence, his ravings will be dismissed as the fantasies of a damaged mind. They fled up the stairs, leaving Tom Hendricks collapsed beside the altar. Above us, I could hear running footsteps, doors slamming, and the sound of vehicles starting up. Emily and I emerged from our hiding place as the sound of the cult's vehicles faded into the distance. Tom Hendricks was unconscious but breathing, and I could hear Sheriff Nolan's voice upstairs calling for us to come out with our hands visible. How did they know to come? I asked Emily as we helped Tom to his feet. She smiled weakly. I called them before we left your place. Anonymous tip about suspicious activity at the Henderson place. I figured even if we didn't find evidence, at least the police would be here to investigate. Smart girl. Smarter than me, certainly. We made our way upstairs, supporting Tom between us, and emerged to find the house surrounded by police cars and emergency vehicles. Sheriff Nolan stood in the front yard looking grim and tired. Ezra? He called out when he saw me. What the hell are you doing here? Long story, Sheriff, I said. But you're going to want to see what's in that basement. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and controlled chaos as law enforcement processed the scene at the Henderson place. EMTs took Tom Hendricks to the hospital, where doctors said he would eventually recover but would need weeks of care to undo the damage of his captivity. Sheriff Nolan examined the photos on my phone with a mixture of horror and professional skepticism. Even with most of the ritual implements gone, enough evidence remained in the basement chamber to confirm Emily's story. The symbols painted on the walls, the stained altar, the personal belongings of the missing people, it painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss. Christ. Ezra, Sheriff Nolan said, shaking his head as he scrolled through the images. Why didn't you come to me first? Would you have believed us? I asked. Without proof? He was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. Probably not. Sam seemed like a normal guy when I met him. Weird maybe, but not dangerous. The cult had vanished completely, leaving behind only the house and 3 abandoned vehicles. Samuel and his core followers had apparently escaped in other cars, probably stored off-site for exactly this kind of emergency. A statewide APB was issued, but I had a feeling they were already far away. Emily spent the night at the hospital for observation, exhaustion and dehydration finally catching up with her, now that the immediate danger had passed. I gave my complete statement to the state police investigators who arrived the next morning, then finally went home to try to process what had happened. The media descended on Three Forks like a plague of locusts. News vans lined Main Street, reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and our quiet little town became the center of a national story about cult activity and ritual murder. The attention was overwhelming and deeply unwelcome. Jack found me at home 2 days later, looking haggard and shaken. Jesus, Ezra, he said, slumping into one of my kitchen chairs. I can't believe this was happening right under our noses. None of us could have known, I said, though the words felt hollow. There had been signs, the isolation of the cult, their strange behavior, the mysterious disappearances. If we'd been more vigilant, more willing to look past the surface, maybe Lisa Thompson and Bill Evans would still be alive. The FBI found evidence of at least 6 murders, Jack continued, bodies buried in the woods behind the house. Some of them have been there for months. 6 murders, 6 people who had trusted Samuel's promises of community and purpose, only to become victims of his twisted beliefs. The thought made me sick. What about Emily? Jack asked. How's she holding up? Better than you'd expect, I said. Emily had shown remarkable resilience, working with investigators to provide details about the cult's operations and helping them understand Samuel's psychological manipulation techniques. She's talking about staying in Three Forks permanently. Says she wants to help the community heal. Over the following weeks, more details emerged about Samuel's cult. They had been operating for over 2 years, moving from town to town whenever local authorities got too interested. Three Forks was supposed to be their final stop, the place where Samuel would complete his great work and achieve the spiritual transcendence he preached about. The FBI profiler assigned to the case explained that Samuel was a classic cult leader, charismatic, manipulative, and utterly convinced of his own divine mission. He recruited vulnerable people like Emily, isolated them from outside influences, then gradually broke down their psychological defenses until they would do anything he asked. The scary thing, the profiler told me during one interview, is how normal these people can seem on the surface. Samuel passed background checks, had no criminal record, presented himself as a legitimate religious leader. If not for your actions and Miss Emily's courage, he might have continued killing indefinitely. The investigation eventually wound down, with Samuel and his core followers still at large, but the immediate threat eliminated. Life in Three Forks slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the shadow of what had happened would always linger over our community. Emily kept her word about staying in town. She found work at the local diner and gradually became a part of our community, though I could see the trauma in her eyes whenever someone mentioned the Henderson place. We grew closer over the months that followed, bonded by our shared experience and the knowledge that we had looked evil in the face and lived to tell about it. The Henderson place itself stood empty once again, though now it was officially condemned and scheduled for demolition. The local government wanted to erase all traces of what had happened there, to reclaim the land and build something positive in its place. I supported that decision. Some places carry too much darkness to ever be truly clean again. One evening in early spring, about 6 months after the events at the Henderson place, Emily and I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold. The worst of the media attention had died down, and Three Forks was learning to be a quiet small town again. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't let me in that night?" Emily asked. I considered the question. Tom Hendricks would be dead. Maybe others too if Samuel had found more victims. The cult would still be out there somewhere continuing their killing. And if they had caught me before I reached your house? "Don't think about that," I said firmly. "You were brave enough to escape, smart enough to find help, and strong enough to see it through. That's what matters." Emily smiled, but I could see the sadness that never quite left her eyes. Surviving Samuel's cult had saved her life, but it had also cost her the innocence that most people her age took for granted. She would always carry the knowledge of what humans were capable of when they surrendered their moral compass to a charismatic leader. "Have you heard anything new about the investigation?" she asked. I shook my head. "FBI thinks Samuel and his people are probably hiding out somewhere in Canada or Mexico by now. They had this planned out too well to get caught easily." The thought that Samuel was still out there, possibly rebuilding his cult and finding new victims, was a constant source of anxiety for both of us. But there was nothing more we could do except hope that law enforcement would eventually track him down. "I had another nightmare last night," Emily said quietly, "about the basement, about what would have happened if we'd been caught down there." "That's normal," I said, though I'd been having my own nightmares about the ritual chamber and the terrified man in the cage. "Maybe you should talk to someone. There are counselors who specialize in this kind of trauma." "Maybe," she said, but I could tell she wasn't ready for that step yet. Emily was strong, but she was also stubborn, convinced that she could work through her psychological wounds on her own. We sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Three Forks spread out below us, peaceful and ordinary, showing no signs of the horror that had briefly taken root here. Children rode their bicycles through the streets, families gathered on their porches, and the warm glow of windows promised safety and normalcy. But I knew that beneath the surface our community had been forever changed. We had learned that evil could wear a friendly face and speak in soothing words. We had discovered that the most dangerous predators were often those who promised salvation while delivering damnation. The experience had also taught us something else, though, that ordinary people could find extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Emily had risked everything to escape Samuel's control and warn others. I had set aside my natural caution to help a stranger in need. Together we had done what needed to be done even when it meant facing our worst fears. "Ezra," Emily said, breaking the silence. "Yeah? Thank you. For believing me, for helping me, for everything." Thank you for having the courage to knock on my door, I replied, and for trusting me with the truth. She leaned against my shoulder and we watched the lights of Three Forks twinkle in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, new opportunities to choose between comfort and courage. But tonight we were safe and we were together, and we had survived something that should have destroyed us. In the distance, I could see the dark outline of the ridge where the Henderson place sat empty and condemned. Soon it would be gone, reduced to rubble and memories, and something new would take its place. But I would never forget what had happened there, or the lesson it had taught me about the thin line between civilization and chaos. Life in Three Forks went on, as life always does, carrying its mixture of joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and loss. But now it carried something else as well, the knowledge that when darkness threatened our community, we had found the strength to stand against it. And if it ever came again, we would be ready. My name is Wohali Sequoia, eagle who soars above the written word, and I am the fourth generation of my family to serve as guardian of these ancient mountains. The Cherokee blood that flows through my veins carries the memory of every tree, every stream, and every shadow that dwells within the deep pine national forest of western North Carolina. My great-grandfather used to tell me that our people were placed here not just to protect the forest, but to maintain the balance between the world of men and the world of things that should remain hidden. For 15 years, I have served as head park ranger of this 40,000-acre wilderness, where the mist clings to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping spirits. Most visitors see only the beauty, the cascading waterfalls, the pristine hiking trails, the black bears that lumber through clearings at dusk. They do not see what I see. They do not hear the warnings that echo through the valleys when the wind shifts just right, carrying with it the scent of something ancient and wild. The call came in at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October, when the autumn chill had already begun to bite through even the thickest ranger jacket. Sarah Martinez, my communications officer, sounded shaken when she radioed me at my cabin. "Wohali, we've got a situation. Family of 4, the Hendersons from Charlotte, failed to return from their camping trip. They were supposed to check out yesterday morning." I was already reaching for my boots before she finished speaking. Missing persons cases in Deep Pine were rare, but they carried a weight that settled deep in my chest like cold stones. Where were they camping? Site 47. Up near Raven's Hollow, my blood went cold. Raven's Hollow sat at the edge of what my grandmother had called the quiet places, areas where even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, where the very air felt thick with watching eyes. The Cherokee have a name for such places, NVHI Ayeli, the breathing ground, where the earth itself seems alive with something that does not welcome human presence. "I'll assemble a search team," I said, but Sarah's voice crackled back with urgency. "There's more, Wohali." The campground manager said he found their campsite this morning. Everything was still there, tent, gear, food, but it looked like they'd left in a hurry. And there were tracks. What kind of tracks? The silence stretched long enough that I thought we'd lost connection. When Sarah's voice returned, it was barely above a whisper. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. 18 inches long, maybe more. And deep, like whatever made them was carrying a lot of weight. I closed my eyes and felt the familiar chill that had haunted my family for generations. My great-grandfather had warned me about such tracks, about the times when the Sul Kalu, the ancient guardians of the deep forest, revealed themselves to the world of men. He called them the keepers of the game, beings that had walked these mountains since before the Cherokee first glimpsed their peaks. Usually they remained hidden, content to observe from the shadows. When they revealed themselves, it meant the balance had been disturbed. Within an hour, I had assembled my best team. Jake Morrison, a former Marine with tracking skills that bordered on supernatural. Elena Vasquez, our emergency medical technician who could navigate the most treacherous terrain without breaking stride. And Tommy Crow Feather, my cousin, and the only other person on my team who understood the old stories and their significance. As we loaded our gear in the pre-dawn darkness, Tommy pulled me aside. His weathered face was etched with concern, and when he spoke, it was in the Cherokee tongue of our childhood. Ozda Sunale, Wohali, Elohino Galisquat Nageswai. The darkness is thick, Eagle. Something walks that should not walk. I nodded, feeling the weight of ancestral knowledge settling on my shoulders like a mantle. You've felt it too, for 3 days now. The forest has been quiet, too quiet. Even the ravens have stopped calling near the hollow. He glanced toward the tree line where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the canopy. Whatever took them, it's old. Older than the stories. As we drove toward the trailhead, I found myself thinking about the last time tracks like these had been found in deep pine. It was 12 years ago, when a group of college students had vanished near the same area. We'd found them 3 days later, wandering on a highway 30 miles away with no memory of how they'd gotten there. They spoke of a tall figure in the trees watching them, following them, but could provide no other details. The state psychiatric evaluation had classified it as shared psychotic disorder brought on by wilderness, exposure and dehydration. I knew better. The trailhead parking area was empty except for the Henderson silver SUV, sitting exactly where they'd left it 3 days ago. As I approached the vehicle, I noticed the first sign that this would not be an ordinary search and rescue operation. The car's windows were fogged from the inside. Despite the cool morning air, and when I peered through the glass, I could see handprints pressed against the interior surfaces, as if someone had been trapped inside, desperately trying to get out, but the doors were unlocked, and there were no signs of struggle around the vehicle. Tommy appeared at my shoulder, his face grim. "Wahali, look at this." He was pointing to the ground beside the driver's door where the morning dew had settled on the asphalt. There, pressed deep into the soft earth at the edge of the parking area, was a single footprint. It was massive, easily 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide, with what appeared to be toe impressions that were distinctly human in shape, but unnaturally elongated. "Jesus," Jake whispered, crouching beside the print. "What the hell made this?" I knelt beside him, studying the impression. The depth and clarity of the track suggested something impossibly heavy had passed this way recently. But it was the other details that made my skin crawl, the way the toes seemed to grip the earth, as if whatever had made the print possessed not just human intelligence but human intent. "We need to move fast," I said, standing and adjusting my pack. "If the Hendersons are still in the forest, they're in danger." As we began our hike toward Raven's Hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet, with none of the usual sounds of wildlife that typically accompanied the dawn hours. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. 3 miles up the trail, Elena made the discovery that confirmed my worst fears. "Ranger Sequoia," she called from a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards off the main path. "You need to see this." When I reached her position, she was standing beside a massive tree trunk, staring upward with an expression of barely controlled terror. Following her gaze, I saw them. Claw marks gouged deep into the bark, starting about 10 feet up and extending nearly to the tree's crown. The marks were fresh, with sap still weeping from the wounds, and they formed a pattern that suggested something had climbed the tree with deliberate, methodical movements. But it was what I saw at the base of the tree that made my blood run cold. Scattered around the trunk were pieces of clothing, a child's sneaker, a torn fragment of a woman's jacket, and a man's baseball cap. All bore the unmistakable signs of having been removed forcibly, with fabric tears that spoke of great strength applied with frightening precision. "They were here," I said quietly, more to myself than to my team, "but they're not anymore." Tommy emerged from the tree line, his face pale. The tracks continue deeper into the forest. They're heading toward the old growth section. The old growth section. My grandmother had warned me never to enter that part of the forest alone, especially not during the dark of the moon. It was there, she said, that the Sulkalu had made their home since the beginning of time, in caves and hollow trees that existed beyond the reach of human maps. As we prepared to follow the trail deeper into the wilderness, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of calling for backup, instead of involving federal search and rescue teams who would bring their helicopters and their modern equipment and their complete ignorance of what we were truly hunting, I decided to handle this the way my ancestors would have, with respect for the old ways and an understanding that some hunts require more than human strength. I was about to learn that some hunts also require more than human courage. The deeper we ventured into the old growth section of deep pine forest, the more the world around us seemed to shift and change in ways that defied natural explanation. The trees here were ancient beyond measure, towering white pines and hemlocks that had been saplings when my ancestors first walked these mountains. Their trunks were so massive that it would take 4 grown men holding hands to encircle them, and their canopy was so dense that even at midday, the forest floor existed in a perpetual twilight. But it was the silence that unnerved me the most. In all my years as a ranger, I had never experienced such complete absence of sound. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects, nothing but the soft crunch of our boots on the carpet of pine needles and the occasional whisper of wind through the upper branches. The Hendersons' trail was easy to follow at first. The massive footprints that had appeared alongside their tracks at the campsite continued here, sometimes walking parallel to the family's path, sometimes crossing it, always maintaining what seemed like a deliberate distance. It was Tommy who first noticed the pattern. "Look at this," he said, crouching beside a particularly clear set of impressions. "The big tracks, they're not just following the family, they're herding them." I knelt beside him and studied the ground. He was right. The enormous footprints formed a rough semicircle around the Hendersons' path, gradually converging to force them toward a specific direction, deeper into the forest away from any marked trails, toward terrain that would make rescue increasingly difficult. "Whatever's doing this," Jake said, his voice tight with tension, "it's smart. Military smart." Elena looked up from where she was examining a broken branch. "These breaks are fresh, maybe 6 hours old. And look at the height." She pointed to damage on the trees that extended well above our heads, gouges and broken limbs that suggested something very tall had passed this way, marking its territory as it moved. We had been hiking for nearly 4 hours when we found the first shelter. It was Tommy who spotted it, a crude lean-to constructed from fallen branches and pine boughs, hidden in a small clearing about 100 yards off the main deer path. The construction was rough but functional, clearly built by someone with knowledge of wilderness survival techniques. What made it remarkable was not its presence but its size. The shelter was enormous, easily 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling height that would have accommodated someone over 7 feet tall. "The Hendersons?" Jake wondered aloud. I shook my head. "Look at how the branches are broken off, not cut. And see these footprints around the perimeter?" The same massive track circled the shelter in a deliberate pattern, as if something had been pacing around it, perhaps considering its construction or marking it as territory. But there were other prints too, the familiar boot treads of hiking shoes, child-sized sneaker impressions, and what appeared to be bare human footprints. "They were here," Elena confirmed, pointing to a small pile of granola bar wrappers near what would have been the shelter's entrance, but not by choice. The evidence told a disturbing story. Scattered around the shelter were items that clearly belonged to the Henderson family: a child's stuffed animal, a woman's hair tie, a man's watch with its band torn as if it had been forcibly removed. But there were also other objects that made no sense. Strange arrangements of stones that formed patterns I recognized from my grandmother's stories, bundles of herbs that had been carefully harvested and tied with what appeared to be twisted grass, and carved symbols on nearby trees that resembled no written language I had ever encountered. "Tommy," I called, gesturing toward the symbols. "Have you seen markings like these before?" My cousin approached the carved trees with obvious reluctance, his weathered hands tracing the deep gouges in the bark without actually touching them. When he looked up, his face had gone ashen. "These aren't Cherokee," he said quietly. "They're older, much older." He paused, glancing around the clearing as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "My grandfather told me about markings like these. He said they were territorial claims, made by the old ones who walked the forest before our people arrived." "The Tsolkalu?" he nodded. "But if they're making territory markers, it means they're planning to stay. And if they've taken the family..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. In the old stories, when the forest guardians claimed humans, it was rarely temporary. We pressed deeper into the wilderness, following a trail that became increasingly difficult to navigate. The massive footprints led us through dense thickets that seemed to part only reluctantly, across rocky streams where the water ran black and ice-cold, and up steep inclines that left us gasping in the thin mountain air. With each mile, I felt the weight of watchful eyes growing heavier, as if the forest itself was aware of our presence and debating whether we represented a threat. It was late afternoon when we heard the first sound that wasn't made by our own passage, a low, resonant call that seemed to emanate from the very mountains themselves. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, neither animal nor human, but something that somehow managed to convey both intelligence and warning. The sound rolled through the forest like distant thunder, causing birds to suddenly burst from the canopy in panicked flight and sending a family of deer crashing through the underbrush in their haste to escape. "That came from ahead of us," Jake whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. "Maybe a quarter mile," Elena agreed, but her voice carried a tremor that I had never heard before. Tommy grabbed my arm. "Well, Holly, we need to stop. Now. The family is still out there. Listen to me." His grip tightened, and when I looked into his eyes, I saw fear that went deeper than concern for the missing hikers. "That sound? My grandfather described it to me once. He said it was the voice of the Sul Kalu when they were calling to each other across the valleys. It means we're in their territory now. Real territory, not just the forest they watch over. So what are you suggesting? That we turn back?" "I'm suggesting that we're being hunted." As if summoned by his words, a branch snapped somewhere in the forest behind us. We all turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except shadow and the gentle sway of pine boughs in the afternoon breeze. Then another branch broke, this one to our left, followed by the soft whisper of something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the range of our vision. "Circle formation," I ordered quietly. "Back to back. Elena, get your emergency beacon ready." We formed a tight defensive circle, each of us facing outward into the forest. For several minutes we stood motionless, listening to the subtle sounds of something or someone moving around us in a slowly contracting spiral. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying us, perhaps evaluating whether we posed a threat or represented an opportunity. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow among shadows, a darker patch of forest that seemed to shift and move independently of the wind. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, the shadow resolved into a shape that made my breath catch in my throat. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark, coarse,